Hello and welcome to another episode of the Renewable Energy Movement, powered by Kigyo. This week's guest is Laurens van Ochten. Laurens is Dutch native, although now based in Germany, and he's operating as head of BESS, which of course is a really interesting topic for R.Power. How is that for an intro, Laurens?
Great, thank you, Tom. It's a pleasure to speak today. I'm excited to have a brief introduction on where I came from, and of course, like to touch upon some topics on BESS, which I guess is really the most exciting thing right now happening in renewables right now. So yeah, happy to dive in.
Yeah, great stuff. Yeah, I think of course we're going to migrate naturally to your current role, but as ever, let's start at the beginning. How was your journey into the renewable sector?
Yeah, so to be very honest, it might not be the the most exciting answer, but my very first position in renewables was more of a coincidence. I sort of stumbled into renewables coming actually from controlling finance background, and then decided this was not for me and wanted something new. And I started as a project manager for PV projects in the Netherlands. Back then also based in Munich. It involved a lot of traveling, on average like 2 days a week, traveling from Munich to the Netherlands, doing all the appointments, municipalities, landowners, visiting construction sites. So this I did for quite a while. I did it from 2016, 17, I think, until 2021. Really the focus was on utility scale PV in the Netherlands, so anything roughly 10 megawatts and above. And then it naturally sort of transitioned into a role with more responsibilities. And at the same time, also the focus of the role shifted more towards Germany. And we saw like that the PPA market in Germany was becoming stronger and stronger. So I transitioned together with this new movement of PPA projects to the German market. And there I led the team. I developed, together with the team, we developed PPA projects in Germany, a little bit bigger than what we used to do in the Netherlands, more like 50 to 100, 120 megawatts. And then after that, I decided that it was time to move on, and I joined R.Power, back then as head of Western Europe, where I oversaw the German and Italian market, both PV and BESS. And then a little bit more opportunistically, also some wind. And I've been doing that now for roughly around 3 years. And earlier this year, I moved on to the head of BESS at R.Power. So we're currently covering 6 countries, being Poland, of course, our home market for R.Power, Romania, Germany, Italy, Spain, and Portugal. And basically what we have is that we have a centralized BESS team within our organization. And we support all the different work streams and departments that have anything to do with BESS, basically. So we support the development teams in all the different countries. We support the procurement teams. We support construction, offtake teams, finance. Yeah, so this is really the way we have structured it. And for me personally, it has been a very exciting role. Of course, like having to do with BESS much more on a operational, like from a development point of view, operational, not like as in operating the assets. Like in Germany and Italy in my previous role, and now moving on to having one more countries, but at the same time, of course, also much more in-depth insight into all the different work streams that need to come together. And not just development, but also structuring the offtake, how like the risk that we see with construction, the grid side of the projects. Of course, the local differences between all the countries. So yeah, personally for me, it has been a very exciting journey. Yeah, I'm really enjoying it so far.
Yeah, just before we get into what you're doing currently, going back to your role at Kronos. So just to be clear, were you developing projects in the Netherlands, or were you developing projects in Germany?
Originally in the Netherlands. As I said, these were like roughly 10. I think the biggest one was 20, 25 megawatts. So anything between there, EV only. And then I moved on to Germany once the PPA market sort of opened up in Germany. And we did German PPA projects. We developed them. Yeah, and then after that, I moved on, of course, to R.Power and widened the scope a little bit.
And how did you find, I suppose, working the German market as a non-German national at that point?
Yeah, I think it's, to be honest, as a Dutch person, I think German is not the hardest country to sort of get used to. There are a lot of similarities. Of course, there are also some key differences. But overall, I think we got along quite well. There were some things to get used to, especially in terms of the convincing people that this is something good to do, to make this step forward. I had the feeling that sometimes in the Netherlands, like if I compare one to the other, like in the Netherlands, sometimes I think this was a little bit more apparent to people what we're trying to accomplish here. Maybe it was also just like a different kind of resistance to something new. But over time, of course, like this also completely changed in Germany. And the other thing, of course, that makes a very big difference is simply the population density. So if we look at the Netherlands, I think some of the early projects that we did, you also saw that there were so many people living directly around surrounding the PV projects. That very quickly you were sort of requested by the municipalities and by the regions to do a kind of a co-creation or like a joint development with stakeholders and neighbors. So you ended up thinking and rethinking the project 6-7 times until you arrived at a final version that was acceptable for all parties. And the interesting thing is that actually some of the, I think, most interesting projects actually came from there. Like you have increased biodiversity because you have a lot of free area with like, together with like ecologists, like you designed like a special flower mix that's grown there. You have hunting poles in the PV projects, e-bike charging stations, lookout towers, viewpoints. So this is something, of course, that from a pure development point of view, you would not very quickly do, but because you had to deal with so many local stakeholders, and simply the fact that everybody lived 20, 30, 50 meters next to a PV park, you had to make sure that it was acceptable for all parties. And then, of course, in Germany, you also have these kind of projects, but at the same time, it also happens quite often that you have projects that are much, much more remote. And this, of course, gives other possibilities to still add biodiversity, but it's a different kind of discussion, of course, than when you have like 5 people that have their backyard basically bordering the PV plant. So yeah, I think this was a big difference, but at the same time, I think in terms of development, they're very similar. Like both countries have very similar development regimes. I think, for example,
structure, right?
Yeah, the way you proceed, like the approvals you need to get, it's very similar. Whereas if you would compare it, for example, to Italy, I think it's much more different. Much more where, for example, Germany and the Netherlands, they're very bottom up. So you go to the local municipality, you speak to the local council, you speak to neighbors, stakeholders. Whereas, for example, in Italy, it's much more top down. So they changed it now recently. But in the past, you submitted your documents to the region or to the ministry in Rome. And then from there, the procedure was basically run. So in the end, it's a completely opposite way of development.
Yeah.
But to compare the Netherlands and Germany, I think it was still very, very similar.
And you raised an interesting point a few minutes ago about like early adoption. The Netherlands was certainly early to be on, the trend of solar, for whatever you want to call it. You mentioned when you got to Germany, like the convincing took a little bit more. Did you experience that in any other countries that you've worked in since as well?
Yeah, I think maybe like the interesting thing is that, of course, I think that chronologically, I think Germany was ahead of the Netherlands, right? Like they had like a lot of these small EEG projects since a long, long time. Then, of course, like the Netherlands came with a subsidy scheme, which really pushed forward the industry in the Netherlands. And then afterwards, when we focused back to Germany, of course, you saw that like they were subsidy-free projects, right? Like, so the first EEG projects in Germany were, of course, subsidy-based. Then the first projects in the Netherlands, they were heavily subsidy-based. And then, like component prices coming down, efficiencies going up. At that stage, you saw that you could do subsidy-free PPA projects. And at that stage, of course, like one of the critical things was, of course, economies of scale. So you saw quite often that these PPA projects that we then did in Germany, they were sizable, right? Like 50, 80, 100 hectare, which in itself is, of course, a different kind of discussion to have with a municipality, right? When you have a smaller village and you are planning or proposing to put next to this village a 100 hectare solar park. So maybe this is also part of the dynamics, right? What changed? In the past, maybe people were used to having 10 hectares next to train tracks. And then due to all these movements and like the subsidy-free movement, PPA projects, you suddenly were facing 100, 150 hectare projects in rural areas.
Yeah, I should have stated utility scale, but I know exactly what you mean. And while we're on the topic of, let's say, different countries and different areas that you've worked in, you obviously had good PV solar experience in the Netherlands, Germany, Italy. Now moving on to more areas of Eastern Europe as well. Let's touch on the grid access for a moment. How does the grid access differ, or the issues with grid access differ across countries?
I think it's a very interesting and it's a crucial difference, right? Like if we simply compare, let's say, if we still include the Netherlands, even though I haven't done much in the Netherlands since many years. Back then, of course, like you could basically request a grid connection. You had to pay a small amount, and you could basically make a kind of reservation for your project. Then, for example, if we look at the German situation over the last couple of years, it was very similar. You could basically, if your project had a certain maturity, make your grid request. And if there was grid available, you could proceed, make the reservation. If you had some documents from the municipality, like a initial zoning approval or something similar, you could make the reservation and you could move on, and you basically had very little risk in your project. And of course, also like the cost of like requesting this grid access are quite minimal in Germany and the Netherlands. Whereas, for example, if we compare it to Romania, you need to invest significantly more compared to Germany and the Netherlands to basically come to a grid access solution. It needs to be decided upon, it needs to be calculated, it needs to be double checked by somebody that's authorized to do so on behalf of DSO and TSO. So you need to invest in all these kind of studies. It needs to go through all kinds of committees until you arrive at your final grid connection solution. So in this regard, of course, there's a little bit more risk involved at the early stages where you think, okay, we might have an interesting project subject to the grid access. And then I guess if we continue this sort of ladder a little bit more, and we arrive to Spain, of course, where like we famously are waiting all for sort of like grid auctions, concursos. It's much more difficult, of course. Like you see that grid is quite limited. Everybody is desperately waiting for release of new capacity. If there are any announcement made, everybody is very keen on double checking where is the capacity freed up, what can we do with this information, where can we move ahead. And then I think right now from the countries where we are active, like topping the ladder would definitely be Portugal, for example, where you see that grid access is very limited. Basically, currently like all the BESS initiatives, the majority of it is hybridisation of existing assets. Every now and then there's some release of capacity when they tear down like an old power plant, and then this capacity is auctioned. But also even in Portugal right now, you see, of course, the discussion about the announced capacity market. We don't have many details about it yet, but of course, like it shows that they're thinking of something is moving in the background. So this gives us some sort of hope that also in the near future, these markets that are currently quite restricted might actually allow for a little bit more, so let's say, free development.
It's quite interesting. I didn't know that about Romania, for example. It's not market that we work in. How does that affect the way in which projects are planned for? And because you've obviously got
so it basically I think what it does is that to a large extent it puts grid first, which to a certain extent makes sense at all times, right? Because like especially for BESS, it's quite relevant where you put your BESS in the grid. And of course, like you can have hundreds of PV, BESS, and wind projects, but without a grid access, they're worth nothing. So it's the crucial point. But in Romania, of course, like having to do all of these studies at a very early stage, it basically means that grid comes first, then your project will follow.
Does that mean that there are less? How do I word this correctly? Projects are less likely to falter before completion, or does it not have an impact?
Yeah, I do think when you would hear about projects publicly, generally this means that the IPP, the developer, the utility behind it, they have a very good understanding of their grid cost, where to connect, how to connect, what are the constraints. So this is very clear at that stage. Well, this would definitely this would definitely be also an advantage of this approach, right?
Sure, yeah, it's in my head it seems that way, but I guess it has its own challenges as well.
Yeah, like everything has a pro and con, right? Like if we go back to like a few years ago in Germany, much less like BESS related, right? Because as you might have heard right now, of course, like grid access in Germany for BESS projects is quite limited as well. It seems very much so that the DSOs and the TSOs, they were sort of a little bit overrun by like the fast adoption of BESS by developers, by the markets, and they're sort of trying to figure out how to do this in a proper way without avoiding, like having best installations in the most unlogical locations or putting too much strain on the grid where they actually don't need it. So things can change very quickly. Because I think if you would have said this a year, 1.5 years ago, everybody would have said, okay, in Germany, it's very easy, low cost to do the request. You very quickly can get information about your grid access, and then basically, as long as you show that your project is moving forward, you can de-risk this part. And right now, of course, we have a completely opposite situation, simply because the market moved ahead so quickly, and you saw that so many grid requests were being put forward because the hurdles were so small, right? Like everybody could basically submit their grid request for very little costs. No huge documentation needed. And this, of course, is a little bit like the pitfall that we see right now. That the fact that it was so easy, and so the entry level or the entry barrier was so low to put these grid requests forward. You see basically that companies simply felt like massive amounts of grid requests. Also for projects that were so-called paper projects, right? Where there's no project.
Yeah.
So everything has a pro and con, right? Like very open and easy grid access has definitely an advantage. At the same time, having a little bit of a hurdle to overcome early on does make sure that you will think twice, of course, before you file like 30, 40 grid requests without having the rest of your project at least like a good understanding of it.
Yeah, and from a purely staffing perspective, which is the, still the main part of my business, I see this now in Germany a lot. A lot of people coming onto the market, a lot of smaller companies releasing people, not extending contracts. These paper projects haven't come to fruition, so can't afford to continue. Yeah, it's got quite a negative impact on the market, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
Moving on to your current role then, which is now head of BESS for R.Power. I always ask on this podcast what people think is the future of renewables. BESS is nearly always mentioned. We nearly always discuss grid issues in some capacity, depending on what country I have a guest on from. What is your specific role with BESS now? And yeah, you mentioned the countries, but what are you actually responsible for?
Yeah, so as I said, like I think it's crucial to understand that, of course, like we sort of centralized like our BESS effort. So we are supporting all the different departments within R.Power, all the different work streams that have anything to do with BESS. And ultimately, we are trying to push and drive all the BESS projects within our company from start to finish. And the main reason for this structure is that this allows us to act sort of like a product owner, a bit more of a holistic approach, allowing us to break a little bit with the traditional way of doing things, like the traditional PV focus that, of course, based on our history we have, and to really make sure that BESS is a core component of our daily DNA.
Yeah.
So yeah, but maybe to go a little bit more into my role, like, but by no means I'm a technical expert on BESS topics. But luckily, we have some of the best people on our team regarding BESS technology, the grid side of things, development, and it's mainly my role to make sure that we bring all these people together, engage them in the right time, in the right moment, but at the same time, of course, actually to enable them to provide the support we need for each project at the right time, the right moment, to make sure that we drive them forward as efficiently as possible.
And how does it work with permitting on BESS? Is it similar to solar procedures in said countries, or is it a little bit easier? Or?
I would say generally it's very similar, but I would say that in In most cases, it's a little bit easier. In most cases, you see that either there is, for example, for the environmental part, it's either a simplified procedure or there's no specific environmental part, which I guess to a large extent makes sense, right? If you compare it to a very large utility scale PV project spreading over several tens or hundreds of hectares, or like a wind park affecting a very large area, and then of course like a BESS that affects a much smaller area. So this is the main difference that I would say we see in the markets. And another thing that you see more and more in different countries is of course the push for hybridization. Which actually I think it's one of the big opportunities that we have ahead of us. But this is definitely something that you see more and more, where like also regulators they will push to allow addition of BESS into an existing PV project, where you say, okay, we already permitted this project, we already ran through all the environmental aspects, so let's also allow the addition of storage there.
Yeah.
So yeah, but this is definitely, regardless of that, I do think this is another big opportunity that we have coming up soon. Yeah.
And is that like a strategy of you guys at R.Power? Would you look to tag on BESS into projects that you've already been approved?
Oh, definitely. This is definitely something we do. So it's really not that we only focus on standalone projects. Wherever it makes sense, we will try and hybridize or do a kind of co-location for our projects. It is also like we already touched upon the topic of grid, right? Like I think you can, to a certain extent, you can consider your grid as a scarce commodity, especially in times where you see grid access becoming restricted or becoming more limited. So in that case, it makes complete sense, of course, to start hybridizing your assets or co-locating your assets, making sure that whatever you already have in terms of grid capacities is used as optimal, in the most optimal way.
Yeah, and I mean this hybridization doesn't have to stop at BESS either, right? I think there's.
No, exactly. I think, to be honest, like so we also have a couple of projects where we're looking into several technologies together. So not just BESS and PV or wind and PV, but for example BESS, PV and wind coupled together. Because you definitely see that these technologies are very complementary to each other. So it would almost be a shame if you do not capitalize on this and you keep adding new assets to it and you forget about optimizing your existing assets.
Yeah. And I mean, is there any, I guess my next question is there any country that's particularly ahead of the game when it comes, I was going to ask when it comes to BESS, but more when it comes to kind of hybridization, would you say?
Yeah, so maybe to answer first the question on the hybridization, I think in all markets you see hybridization going on. I do think that, interestingly enough, for example, we already touched upon it, and this is maybe a nice cross-reference, that you see like the countries where grid access is the most restricted, like Spain and Portugal. You see that on a regulatory level, they are much more pushing for hybridizing and making it easier, like having very clear procedures on how to move ahead and how to add BESS to existing wind or PV assets. So this makes, of course, a lot of sense that they focus on this part. In terms of BESS, I don't think it's hard for me to say if there's one country really ahead of the other countries. I think clearly the UK is the most mature market. But then on continental Europe, there are a lot of markets moving ahead very, very fast. I think interestingly is, for example, the Maxa auction that you might have heard of last week. They ran the first Maxa auction in Italy.
Yeah.
Of course, the anticipation was very, very big, at least for almost over a year. I think everybody has been following the market and looking for updates, new developers entering the market, of course, to hopefully get a piece of the pie as well. And I think this is very big, right? Like it's 10 gigawatts and upcoming tenders of 2020 gigawatts are coming. So I do think this is sort of a confirmation from the market to the market, where you see that the adoption of BESS, it's really there, and it's not just like adoption by the market, but also by the TSO, by regulators, by ministries. And so this, of course, is really a confirmation that BESS is the future.
What are your predictions for the next couple of years in the renewable industry, Laurens?
Yeah, so I think so. Personally, I think that it's extremely exciting to be part of this renewable industry. I think it's relatively young. We still see that we're constantly reinventing ourselves as an industry, right? Like As we already discussed, like a few years ago, you were looking at utility scale PV projects that had to be subsidized. Then we moved away from subsidies into more like PPA driven projects. And I think that right now, if you would have said like 4 or 5 years ago, like large scale utility scale BESS projects, I don't think many people would have believed in that yet. I think any efforts in storage were more like pilot projects or innovation attempts. And now that we see, especially, or maybe linking it with this big adoption that we see now, for example, in Italy as well, with this Maxa, 50 gigawatts run by the TSO, and similar schemes, of course, we see throughout Europe. So I do think this is really something exciting, and I think that the adoption will only get bigger. Like we see direct subsidy schemes, of course, in like Spain and the like. So yeah.
Do you think the max auction was a hot topic in the office this morning as well? We have a big focus on the Italian market, but do you see other countries following suit around that sort of thing?
To be honest, I don't know about like a Max a similar scheme. I think it's quite a unique scheme in itself, how they've set it up, like the scoring system, and like the fact that it's more like I would say simplified, like a tolling agreement with the TSO. So I'm not sure if a whole lot of other markets will follow suit and implement similar schemes. Of course, you do see right now, like, for example, capacity markets coming up, right? So, and BESS is being quite successful in capacity markets in the past as well. I actually think what we will rather see is that we will see much more sophisticated offtake agreements. So basically PPA agreements, that these will become much more sophisticated. And this is then regardless of the country, right? This basically you can implement in every country.
Yeah. Okay. Very interesting. Laurens, in general, I found that really interesting. I won't probe away too much more at what you guys are doing at R.Power without giving it away, but we'll put your LinkedIn profile and details in the comments below, so people can reach out if they wish to discuss in.
Yeah, happy to Kurt.
And thanks very much for coming on. Thanks for giving us the really detailed insights. Cheers.
No worries. Thank you, Tom.